If there's one word that I could use to describe the NES era, it would have to be resurgent. This term is both literal in that it saw the actual resurgence of the video game industry as a whole, and figurative in that it saw a cavalcade of new methods in video game design. And in no singular product was this more pronounced than the original Legend of Zelda. As I've covered in detail before on this channel, that premier title in the Zelda franchise established several firsts in the video game industry. From save game files to subtle offhands game tutorials, that very first Legend of Zelda was not just a great game in its own right, but was also the catalyst for other developers to improve their own game design. With such a perfect pilot title for the series, there was really nowhere to go from there but down for its sequel, at least as long as it was still being produced on the same hardware as the original. But I don't think anyone could have guessed just how downhill that second Zelda title would have been. So, ironically, the bar was reset for Zelda 3, with there really being nowhere to go from there but up. Regardless of Zelda 2's dip in quality, Zelda 3 had more than just the low expectations on its side, as it was once again being developed by Miyamoto and Tezuka, the twin geniuses behind the original Legend of Zelda, and it was also being planned as a debut title for the next generation of consoles. With win like that at its back, the third Legend of Zelda game, titled A Link to the Past in the West, was set to be an instant classic, just like the first game, and that's pretty much what it's become. To this day, it consistently ranks near first on lists of best Zelda games, or even lists of best video games in general. For me, it doesn't quite rank that high, and I personally believe that in the face of several of its successors, it falls quite a bit short in a few departments. But as a whole, A Link to the Past is still a good video game, with a lot of love and care put into its design. And to this day, I'd say that there's still a lot of fun to be found all in this little 16-bit package. So with that glowingly positive tone in mind, let's talk about one of my favorite parts of this entire game: its beginning. A Link to the Past opens up with Zelda quite literally calling the player to adventure. Apparently, she and 6 other girls were kidnapped by a wizard named Aghanim, and now Link needs to save her, since Aghanim's magic is being used to enslave the castle guards. The quality of this story as a whole is something that I'll talk about later in the video, but as an initial motivation for assaulting the castle and rescuing the princess, this telepathy bullshit works fine enough. Hopefully, it won't become overused as the game goes on. Did I just say that? Sorry, I am getting ahead of myself. Still, what makes this intro so effective isn't, God knows, its attempt at establishing the story, but rather its ability to teach the player the game's mechanics almost entirely through the gameplay. The first instance of this is in Link's house, in which lies a chest that sticks out like a sore thumb, prompting the player to naturally try and interact with it, and thus receive the lantern. Right off the bat, this teaches the player several important lessons: to always open chests, to interact with objects in the overworld using the A button, and how to equip and use items using the 2 newly introduced face buttons on the Super Nintendo's controller. This single room at the very beginning of the game has, therefore, already taught the player about half of the controls used throughout the entire game. And it's this rapid, yet natural pace of the game's tutorial that makes it so well designed and impactful. Upon entering the sewer, Link's uncle will give him a sword and shield, and teach the player how to use the new spin attack, finally opening up this game's combat. Now, the player is allowed free reign to explore, fight, and try to progress through Hyrule Castle, and it's at this moment that I just have to praise this game's graphics and music. Seriously, I play all of the games that I review on their original cartridges and on the original hardware just to be as fair as possible, yet this 30-year-old console and cartridge still managed to create one of the most vivid senses of atmosphere in the entire Legend of Zelda series. The sprite work is still gorgeous even by today's standards, and in particular, I have to praise the weather effects and lighting while inside the castle. Sound design is another thing that this game gets right. For example, you can actually hear the muffled noise of the rainstorm outside the castle while you explore the first floor. and it only gets drowned out completely while in the dungeons below the castle. And the music. So many classic themes from the Zelda series saw their debut in this one game, and several of those series staples make their appearance in this opening section alone. Time of the Falling Rain does such a fantastic job at encouraging the player to rush to Zelda's rescue. Its quick tempo simply compels the player towards the front gates of the castle. And once you finally enter, Majestic Castle is such a killer track that it continued to appear in every Zelda game set in Hyrule until Breath of the Wild. Now, I'm not an expert in music composition in the slightest. Hell, half the time I hum something into the microphone while recording, and I can't even tell what it is when editing the audio later. But what I do know is that this song fucking slaps. It just fits the tone of a hero marching forward to save a princess perfectly. And apparently that sentiment was shared so strongly amongst the fans and Koji Kondo that this theme quickly became one of the most repeated tracks in the series' history. Beyond the tone set by the castle and its music, it also does a splendid job of introducing standard dungeon mechanics that will appear throughout the entire game. Enemies, keys, dungeon items, mini-bosses, a big key, and even the shitty dialogue choices that pop up every time you save a maiden. Even though the context of saving Zelda from Hyrule Castle is a little different than delving into dungeons for ancient treasures, the dark lighting and cave-like atmosphere should create a sense of familiarity, and thus allow the player to subconsciously connect the mechanics introduced in Hyrule Castle with the ones seen in future dungeons. Once the player actually saves Zelda and manages to go through the sewers, several more mechanics are introduced. Dark rooms with torch sconces are a staple in the Zelda series, but are introduced for the very first time in this specific location of A Link to the Past. Zelda points out that a lantern would light the way, which will prompt the player to pull theirs out, and find out that it does indeed light dark rooms, just like the candle in Zelda 1. The difference here is in its utility in lighting up the room via specific sconces, which is vital not only in exploring rooms in future dungeons, but even in some puzzle-solving situations and the final boss fight. Later on, the player will hit a dead end in a room with a locked door. The key is hidden on one of the many rats, which the player will undoubtedly kill while exploring it, which serves as a way to inform them that enemies will often hold keys, and thus need to be killed rather than avoided. The player will then have to push some blocks, pull some levers, and finally bring Zelda to safety at Sanctuary. This opening section of A Link to the Past has, thus far, done such a fantastic job of teaching the player how this game is meant to be played, and preparing them for the game's future dungeons by establishing several of their conventions all in this beginning section. A good tutorial must not overstay its welcome, but it also shouldn't fail to teach its player what the staple mechanics of the game will entail. Some games like Zelda 2 don't tell you anything, and thus miss the teaching aspect of a good tutorial, while others, like Persona 5, lack the brief aspect of a video game opening. A Link to the Past manages to hit both nails straight on the head, and is a welcome return to smart game design after the disaster that was Zelda 2. And just like Zelda 1, A Link to the Past manages to nail down not just its tutorial, but also its sense of freedom and exploration within its overworld. Speaking of which, upon exiting Sanctuary, the player is immediately given free reign to explore the world of Hyrule at their leisure. While they are told to go to Kakariko Village to find Sahasrahla, the truth is, he isn't there, and you'll be directed elsewhere to find him instead. I assume that this was done in order to encourage the player to traverse the game world, and to introduce the town of Kakariko Village and the services therein. But the truth is, if you know where he is, you can just beeline it to Sahasrahla himself and not be forced to do this little Kakariko errand, which is a really nice option for returning players, and highlights one of my very favorite things about A Link to the Past's world design. It prioritizes the player's own sense of exploration and freedom above all else, just like in Zelda 1. So long as you complete all of the dungeons and beat Ganon, you beat the game, and you aren't always being forced to do everything in a specific order. This is an essential aspect to have for any game that touts itself on its sense of exploration and discovery, and A Link to the Past delivers on this point and more. Beyond just the necessary exploration that must be completed to advance through the game, there is also much in the way of optional content, with a cavalcade of hidden secrets that can aid Link in his quest. And these include new spells, weapon and equipment upgrades, carrying capacity upgrades, new staves, 4 bottles, and so many more things that I can't even remember. God damn, does this game take its exploration seriously, and it's so much better off for it. Find a suspicious looking bush in the overworld, chop it down, enter a hole, and find a fairy. See a suspicious looking ring of rocks in a river, throw an object into it, and receive a new magic spell. Hear tales of a waterfall of wishing from an old man in a bar? Hell, why not? Find the waterfall, enter it, throw your boomerang into the water, and receive a better one for your honesty. The variants and secrets, the unique ways in which you find them, and the positive feedback loop provided by receiving strength from their upgrades all encourages the player to engage in this wonderful game world's exploration, and have fun while doing it. Zelda 1 had the same idea, but it was limited in its variety. You could only bomb so many walls and burn so many bushes before it lost its charm, which luckily it didn't due to the game's short runtime. But A Link to the Past is much longer and larger in scale, so it's a welcome change to see such a wide variety of in-game secrets that have such a tangible effect on the player's abilities and progression. And if you thought all of that wasn't enough, there's a second overworld in this game just waiting for the player to discover. That's right, this game has 2 overworlds to explore, Hyrule and the Dark World, once a paradise, now made twisted and evil by Ganon's wish upon the Triforce. This new world has its own set of enemies, new environments, NPCs, and secrets to explore. Beyond all of that, you can actually interact with both Hyrule and the Dark World using a magic mirror. Can't find your way up a cliff? Go to the Dark World, stand in the now flat piece of land, and use the magic mirror to teleport you on top of it. Cliffs blocking your path to the marsh? Go find a portal in Hyrule's desert to transport you there directly. Beyond just these environmental interactions, however, are also connections with characters between the 2 worlds, culminating in several side quests. For example, you can find the blacksmith's missing partner in the Dark World during the mid-game, and as a reward for bringing him home, receive an upgrade to the Master Sword. The absolute fan-favorite side quest, though, would have to be the Flute Boy questline. There's a man in the Kakariko Village pub who mentions his lost son. Turns out he's in the Dark World, and the player can find him in a forest that's not too far from the village. The young boy will then ask the player to find his flute, and then play it for him one last time, before he finally turns into a tree. Okay, I'm still saving discussion about this game's plot until later, but this is fucking stupid. I get it, the kid dies, and that's sad, conceptually. But this all goes by so quick, and the death isn't even explained. Is he wounded? Is he sick? Why does he turn into a fucking tree? All of these questions and his lack of character development make it difficult to actually care about this quest, which is a running theme with the game's story as a whole, by the by. But I'm getting ahead of myself. In addition to overworld exploration and side quests, minigames, a series staple in every subsequent Zelda game, make their very first appearance in A Link to the Past. Usually, I myself am not a big fan of Zelda minigames. I only really enjoy the ones that incentivize the player with a piece of heart for their efforts, since that makes the investment all worth it in the end. But luckily, half the minigames here do in fact reward the player with heart pieces, and there's some fun to be had with them regardless of that reward. My least favorites by far are the 3 chest-guessing minigames. 2 of them just provide the chance of winning rupees, and are extremely simple anyways. The third one is a bit more interesting, given that there are 16 chests to choose from, but it's still the same concept. The archery minigame requires a lot of skill with the bow, which I think is an excellent way to reward players who practice enough to become mechanically gifted with their items, except that it provides no rewards beyond rupees, so it feels more like a time killer than anything else. The 15-second minigame is a race to the finish, with an added twist of having to navigate through a maze. The easy way to do this is to wait until acquiring the Pegasus boots, which allow Link to sprint. But a dedicated player can actually optimize his run through trial and error until he finally hits the 15-second mark. I tried doing that on my latest playthrough, and it was pretty cool. It took me about 7 tries, and I had fun trying to create a sequence break and get that piece of heart early. The last minigame is the digging game, and it kinda sucks balls because the rewards are randomized. Whether or not the player will find the piece of heart immediately or in 2 hours is entirely up to the RNG of the minigame, and as such, it requires no skill and demands no growth on the part of the player to overcome it. Still, the plethora of minigames available to the player provides a much needed reprieve from simple exploration, and gives the player a much better option for grinding for rupees than killing enemies over and over again. Combined with the dungeons, A Link to the Past has a surprising amount of variety for the player to experience, especially for a game this old. Speaking of dungeons, once the player finds Sahasrara in the Eastern Ruins, he will task the player with finding the 3 ancient pendants needed to retrieve the Master Sword, all of which are housed in the game's 3 introductory dungeons. These types of dungeons are a first for the Zelda series, though they would later go on to become a recurring, though uncommon, trope. They act as training dungeons of a sort, in order to accustom newer players to Zelda dungeon tropes. While that may sound like a recipe for disaster, potentially creating level designs that baby the player and treat them like amateurs, A Link to the Past manages to use its introductory dungeons in order to teach the player about the 3 major types of level designs that exist in this game. Linear, combat-heavy challenges with some puzzle-solving elements, open-ended dungeons that require player-driven exploration to complete, and puzzle-heavy towers that utilize central dungeon mechanics or themes. Beyond just teaching the player of what's to come, they also manage to be fun dungeons in their own right, consistently challenging players both new and old. The first of these dungeons, East Palace, introduces linear progression through a series of individual challenges separated into different rooms, not too unlike Hyrule Castle. The key difference in East Palace is in how it effectively builds upon its individual challenges and the player's expectations to create a fun dungeon with a great difficulty curve. The very first rooms in East Palace teach the player about pressure plates, and how they're used to open stone doors. First with a pressure plate hidden under a pot, and second by a plate hidden amongst similar looking tiles. After that is a room with a mechanical challenge, a single hallway with several cannons firing away. The player will need to weave in and out of these in order to make it past unscathed, which is particularly important given just how little health the player has at the beginning of the game. Both of these challenges are rather inconsequential when looked at separately, but they're not here to be challenging on their own. They're here to prepare the player for this. This dungeon does such a great job at managing incremental difficulty spikes, such as this one. Another example being the Igors. They make their very first appearance in the room with the bow, which is also their greatest weakness. But this is before acquiring the big key needed to open the chest it's in. These blue ones can, however, still be dealt with using Link's sword, or even the several pots lining the room, so they aren't impossible to kill without it. The red ones, however, can only be dealt with using arrows, and are tougher to kill at that. But they only appeared near the end of the dungeon, long after the player has acquired the bow. This type of level design, wherein key elements to a greater challenge are introduced one at a time leading up to it, is such a great way to accustom first-time players to this game's difficulty. And with East Palace being the game's very first dungeon, it couldn't have possibly fit this role any better. The final boss here is the Armos Knight, or rather 6 of them, and it's at this point that we get to talk about my very favorite thing about A Link to the Past: the boss fights. You see, while future Legend of Zelda games were host to more spectacle-oriented boss fights that required more puzzle-solving skills than actual mechanical prowess, and Zelda 1 was simply too underdeveloped to have consistently challenging boss fights, A Link to the Past focuses squarely on making its boss encounters fit perfectly on the spectrum between tough and fair, while also pushing the game's 16-bit graphics to their absolute limit. Each and every one of these fights is thematic, exhilarating, and more mechanically challenging than any other game in the Zelda series. The very first time I played this game, I died 87 times, and that was in no small part due to just how brutal and unforgiving these fights are. Another wonderful thing about these bosses is in just how many options the player has in taking them down. The Armos Knight here is a good example. In this fight, he'll pull off coordinated attacks with his other copies, stomping in circles or charging in a straight line to hit the player without fail. You might naturally tend to use your sword here, since that's the only weapon you've had access to up until this dungeon. This is extremely dangerous given just how jumpy these things are, and how short your sword is, but it's totally doable if the player is either mechanically gifted enough or came prepared with a couple fairies in tow. The more clever player, on the other hand, can choose to use his newly acquired bow to pick off each knight from a distance. You don't have unlimited ammo, and there are 6 of them, but it is the safer option. This is just the present example at hand, but so many bosses in this game are able to be taken on in multiple ways just like this, which not only gives players the freedom to find styles of combat that work for them, but also rewards more clever players who find out exactly what an enemy's weakness is during the fight, and then exploit it with one of the many dungeon items they have on hand. The next dungeon, the Desert Temple, is very much the antithesis of the East Palace in nearly every way. As you'll notice from this map, the dungeon consists almost entirely of a large single floor with several attached rooms in every direction. There is no guided way forward, and no gated progression either, beyond a single locked door. The goal here is, therefore, rather transparent. Scout the dungeon out for the small key needed to progress forward. The main obstacles to that goal are twofold: the sheer number of dummy rooms containing optional content or traps, and the great number of enemies that will wear the player down as he explores them. The very first foe most players will encounter is the Beamos, who will scan the surrounding area and fire upon any player it finds in its gaze. While troublesome in its own right, the Beamos is still only half the problem. Being that this is the Desert Palace, plenty of enemies will take advantage of the surrounding sand and ambush the player as he's exploring. These foes include good old levers and the newly introduced devil ants, who will pop out of the sand and pull Link into their massive jaws. These are hard-hitting foes that will track you down where you stand, making sure to keep the player on the move as he's looking for the hidden key. Once he finds it and uses it to obtain the big key and power glove, the player can then access the second and third floors of the dungeon, which are fairly insubstantial beyond some turrets you'll need to avoid. The final boss here is the returning Land Mola, 3 to be exact. These foes make use of the newly introduced Z-axis, burrowing underground, then popping back up and potentially flying over the player's head. The challenge of this fight is to correctly guess which direction the Land Molas are preparing to pop out towards, and managing to strike their heads without being hit yourself. As the fight goes on, they'll kick up more and more debris that the player will have to avoid, until finally they're all slain, and the player receives the second pendant. At this point, only one introductory dungeon remains: the Tower of Hera. Whereas the East Palace served as an introduction to linear combat-based challenges, and the Desert Palace tested the player's exploratory skills in a more open-ended environment, the Tower of Hera is focused solely on testing one's puzzle-solving chops, a brand new concept in the Legend of Zelda series. These days, we associate so much of Zelda's identity with puzzles. Even the radically different Breath of the Wild still has the reputation of being the game that let the players solve its puzzles in any way they wanted. But if you remember from the last 2 videos, there really haven't been any puzzles to solve in the first 2 games. Zelda 1 had some blocks to push, but nothing else. The Tower of Hera manages to pull a first in the Zelda series by creating a central dungeon mechanic. In this case, orange and blue fences operated by switches. While one colored fence is up, the other is down, with no way to open or close both at the same time. This effect is permanent, staying active no matter how many floors the player ascends or descends. The trick here is to activate the switches in the correct pattern needed to progress, often requiring the player to think several rooms ahead before choosing whether or not to flip a switch. That requires exploration, of course, and the need to fight off hard hat beetles who will look to push you back down to the lower floors, and thus we see a perfect meld of the major tenets of Zelda gameplay, all in one fantastic dungeon. Combat is necessary to pave the way for exploration, which is then used to plan ahead for puzzle solving, which altogether leads the player to the top of the tower to acquire the Moon Pearl and fight the dungeon boss. Here, you'll fight Moldorm, a boss that is less about whacking until he's dead and more about carefully dueling with while avoiding falling off any ledges. Doing so will require the player to ascend to the boss room once more, and unfortunately, start the whole fight over again. While I think this might be going a little too far, and I can easily see how some players could get frustrated during this fight, I still think it's super creative and designed with some level of fairness, since the game throws you a bone by placing a ton of hearts near the boss room door that can heal you up before giving the fight another try. Killing Moldorm nets the player the third and final pendant, thus deeming him worthy of wielding the Master Sword. Before immediately being told that Zelda got herself kidnapped again, so it's time to go save her. The Master Sword is a kick-ass reward for the player's efforts though, granting a sword beam at full health, and doing twice the damage of your previous sword. With the Blade of Evil's Bane at hand, Aghanim's magic can finally be repelled, and the second assault of Hyrule Castle can commence. And it's nothing special. Seriously, you just fight 12 rooms or so worth of enemies, and then you're at the top, talking to Aghanim. The ensuing boss fight is probably the worst in the game too. You'll play energy tennis with him a couple times. This is what that looks like, by the way, for those of you unfamiliar with the term. And then he's beaten. Aghanim will then drag the player into an alternate dimension known as the Dark World. And what the? Oh no. It's the plot. Now, up until this point in the video, I have been glowingly positive about this game's dungeons and exploration. That is going to change, and I know that might turn some viewers off since, as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, this game is often afforded a level of reverence well beyond any other game that I have talked about on this channel thus far. But I want to preface my future criticisms of the game by saying that I do like it as a whole. I find it fun, and after first experiencing it, I thought it was one of the best Zelda games I had ever played, as admittingly few as that was at the time. But part of why this analysis has taken me so long to make is that upon actually paying attention to the design flaws present in this game, and playing through it 5 times for the sake of this review, I have found a lot to complain about in this game's second half. Beyond that, it's at this point, beginning with the first dungeon, that the game's story goes from mildly bothersome to hilariously terrible, mostly due to how inappropriately conveyed its major plot points are. For such a universally praised game like A Link to the Past, I think that these are some rather glaring issues that I see glossed over far too often, and because of that, combined with their prevalence in the back half of the game, I think it's important to talk about these flaws now. So let's start with the plot, and then continue on with the rest of the dungeons from there. The plot of A Link to the Past is almost entirely dependent on its lore, the history of the world of Hyrule itself. This is a problem for many reasons, but before I state what those are, let's go over what that lore actually is. Long ago, there was a golden power called the Triforce, created by the gods, which had the power to grant the wish of any person who touched it. This power was, however, hidden quite well, in an alternate dimension known as the Golden Land. While many came to the Golden Land in search of the Triforce, only one man was successful in finding it. Ganondorf, the leader of a gang of thieves who used the power of gold to wish for the world to be conquered in his name. This began a war with Hyrule, in which 7 powerful sages and the Holy Knights of Hyrule fought to seal Ganon away in the Golden Land. They were successful, and Ganon was sealed forever. The most fundamental issue with A Link to the Past story is the incorrect focus that Miyamoto and Tezuka had when designing it in the first place. They wanted to create an epic tale, a legend set in a fantastical world, something a player would always remember. This is common with all fantasy RPGs. They create worlds and stories within those worlds that intend to be so grand and memorable that they end up enhancing the overall experience of the game. But what I think many budding fantasy storytellers, particularly ones producing plotlines for video games, seem to forget is that a fantasy tale and its world building is meant to be in service of something greater. That something, most often, is the characters. Characters are the fundamental backbone of storytelling. A good story can be set in literally any world the author chooses, but the characters must be likable and well written for the audience to care about that world. That human element of storytelling is present in all good fantasy fiction. It is the reason why the worlds of Westeros or Middle-earth are as fondly remembered as they are in the first place. They are the homes of those stories' most beloved characters, whom without, those worlds would be empty and meaningless to us as an audience. It is in this regard where A Link to the Past fails miserably, housing some of the most unlikable, bland, and annoying characters in Zelda history. And I played Oracle of Ages. First on that list is Sahasrahla, the old man I've mentioned up until this point. As I just quoted at the end of the last section, Sahasrahla will begin to telepathically communicate information to the player at both triggered events in the story and through stone tablets present throughout the dungeons. His lines of dialogue will then boil down into one of two categories: on-the-nose tutorial information and story exposition. These hints are, at times, detrimental to the dungeon experience. Remember the Igors that I talked about in Eastern Palace, and how the game brilliantly gives the player a silent hint on how to best kill them by placing a bow and arrow in the very room where they're introduced? Well, Sahasrahla takes a fat dump on that design by literally telling the player to kill them with the bow. Moments like these make up more than half of his dialogue, and he's literally the character with the most dialogue in the entire game. This gets so annoying for the player because the hints don't actually tell you anything that the game doesn't already teach you through gameplay. Just listen to some of these quotes. Link, it is I, Sahasrahla. You must never fail to find all the treasures in each dungeon. First of all, that's entirely optional, even in relation to dungeon items in some of the later levels. Not only is this insultingly simple advice, but it's also incorrect. There are even Nintendo Power magazines that suggest skipping a few dungeon items in order to give yourself a challenge. Many people play the game like this, and that's entirely valid. Link, it is I, Sahasrahla the Elder. You must set fire to 4 torches to open the way forward. Here he is just straight up telling the player how to do a puzzle. He is literally spoiling the game's puzzle solving instead of letting the player figure it out for himself. The first time I heard this line, I had already done the puzzle, so it didn't ruin my experience. But this is so antithetical to the very design principle of The Legend of Zelda in the first place that I can't, for the life of me, understand why someone wrote this into the game. Sahasrahla is the main supporting character of this game, and yet he acts more like an annoying friend sitting on the couch telling you what to do at every twist and turn, instead of letting you play the game for yourself. Link, it is I, Sahasrahla. An orb known as the Moon Pearl is in this tower. Whoever holds the Moon Pearl is protected so that his form will not change in the Dark World. You must find it and escape the tower. Don't forget the Moon Pearl, Link! Ignoring for a moment just how annoyingly repetitive that line was, there are literally 2 characters on the way up from Death Mountain who tell the player about the Moon Pearl, making this line completely redundant at this point in the game. Instead of giving a character a line for the 3rd time telling the player to obtain the Moon Pearl, why not just make it a mandatory dungeon item? Dungeons 1 and 2 did this, so why not 3? This telepathy nonsense is so detrimental to the experience, and it adds nothing to the gameplay whatsoever. Additionally, Sahasrahla is also used as a convenient device through which to dump information onto the player in order to further the story. That is his entire purpose in the game. When you meet him, he tells you about the history of the Master Sword. When you finish the first dungeon, he tells you the history of the Sealing War. When you enter the Dark World, he will barrage you with the history of the land and what you must do for the rest of the game to overcome it. If you think I'm cherry picking here, by the way, I just listed all of his lines outside of the telepathic tablet tutorials. That's right. Every line from Sahasrahla is either a lecture on how to complete part of a dungeon or a history lesson. This, unfortunately, is not exclusive to Sahasrahla. There is a sad focus in this game on every main character's dialogue involving an information dump, be it game tips or history lessons about the game world, leading into the main problem with this game's story in the second half. I am now about to show you what happens at the end of Dungeon 4. At this point in the game, Link is saving the 7 girls Aghanim kidnapped at the beginning, including Zelda. This is what the first girl has to say upon the player rescuing her. Link, because
Because of you, I can escape from the clutches of the evil monsters. Thank you. This world used to be the Golden Land where the Triforce was hidden, but because Ganon, the boss of thieves, wished it, the world was transformed. I'm sure he's intending to conquer even our light world after building his power here.
Whoa, slow down there, lady. I just saved you from a dungeon full of deadly, man-eating monsters and lethal traps. Why is my reward a goddamn history lesson? I have a fucking degree in history, and not even I care about this shit. It's so out of left field and does not fit what any person would realistically say after having been saved from a kidnapping. You want to know what a real person would say in this scenario?
Oh, thank God, I've been trapped in this crystal for 4 weeks and I haven't peed once.
None of these girls act like real people. They are mere vehicles through which to give the player background information on the world of Hyrule. This is why the story of A Link to the Past is so terrible. The characters are not talking like real people would, and the plot is more concerned about telling the player the world's history than actually making him care about the present world that history is set in. This detracts from the overall experience because the game tries so hard to make the player care, and spends significant amounts of time doing so. If all this information was just in the manual, I wouldn't even mention it, but it actually detracts from the experience by being in the game itself, and thus, I have to hold this game's story and characters against it when judging the experience as a whole. The next big mistake that the second half of A Link to the Past manages to make is in exploration. I mentioned earlier when talking about the exploration that there are 2 overworlds in A Link to the Past, Hyrule and the Dark World. In that section, I praised the Dark World as adding further to the experience and being connected to Hyrule in meaningful ways. This is true, and I still enjoy the Dark World and all it has to offer. The problem here isn't the overworld itself, it's how the game gates off progression in that overworld. As we'll be getting back to soon enough, once Aghanim pulls Link into the Dark World, the game's 7 main dungeons will open up to the player. But you can't actually do any of them except for one, the very first dungeon. If you try to explore the Dark World anywhere beyond the small strip of land to and from the first dungeon, an arbitrary progression gate will block your path, necessitating the item found in that first dungeon in order to pass them. This is also true of the second dungeon. While it is a staple of Zelda's game design to gate off optional content behind item requirements, and to create soft locks to future dungeons via necessitating items from earlier levels, A Link to the Past makes the mistake of arbitrarily gating off exploration as a whole in order to force the player to do most of the dungeons in a specific order, marked on the map for the player to see. And this is all for one deliberate reason. The developers want you to experience the game's story in a predetermined chronological order. There's an old quote from Miyamoto about this game's design in that regard. The primary source, which I'll link in the description, is an interview from 1994, in which Miyamoto is talking about the development of A Link to the Past. Essentially, Miyamoto attributed the lack of freedom in the back half of the game to the storyline, in order to keep some sense of narrative cohesion while also avoiding taking up too much of the game memory. A problem that most certainly would have stemmed from programming alternate scenarios in which the player goes out of order when tackling the dungeons. This led to the set dungeon order in the Dark World, and subsequently, the walled-off nature of the Dark World itself. Thus, the bad writing in this game is now guilty of another sin, trampling upon player freedom in the pursuit of telling its story. Future Zelda games will do something similar, and I know some people probably prefer linear Zelda. Hell, some of my favorite Zelda titles actually come from that more linear lineup of games. The difference with these titles is that their stories add something important to the overall quality of the game. Remove the plot of Ocarina of Time and the game is fundamentally different, and in a bad way for sure. Take away the thunderous, epic adventure in Twilight Princess, and so much of that game's soul will be missing. Suck out every last bit of dialogue from this title though, and not only would it feel like nothing is missing, but it would actually be so much better off for it, especially if that meant being able to travel around the Dark World without a bunch of arbitrary progression blocks stopping the player in his tracks. Even so, removing those progression gates and rewriting or removing the story would only solve part of the problem with A Link to the Past's second half. That's because the main 7 dungeons suffer from this dip in quality as well, so let's go through the rest of them and see what I mean by that. The very first dungeon in the Dark World, fittingly called the Palace of Darkness, is a bit of a rough start in terms of dungeon design. The main goal here is to find keys needed to progress through the dungeon's many locked doors. In what order you collect them is up to the player. Mostly. There are two potential keys to get from the beginning, one rather obvious, the other requiring a good eye to scout out a bombable wall at the bottom of the right set of stairs. Once the player acquires one or both of these keys, he'll need to figure out what to do next. There are several paths for the player to take here, and this is where the dungeon gets a little convoluted. You see, going to the right and up through these rooms is the wrong way, because you need the dungeon item to progress through here. Alright, so you circle back around to the start, go left, traverse across the room of hard hat beetles, and then the hallway of kinetic death, and bam, a locked door blocks your path. So then you take the door on your right, looking for a key, go downstairs, and finally find it. You go back up, open the door, only to realize you haven't even found the big key yet. So now you have to blow a hole in the ground to get it, which is a completely new concept that the game doesn't teach you before this point. And assuming you brought a spare key to open this door with, you can now get the big key. Then backtrack through all of that again to get the hammer. Then finally, you can get past that very first roadblock. This dungeon's design is both completely convoluted and unnecessarily linear at the same time, which I don't even know how that's possible. The last dungeon, the Tower of Hera, combined the best of both types of designs, creating linear rooms with interesting switch puzzles, while also requiring a good bit of scouting ahead in order to know what order to complete the puzzles in. This is telegraphed from the very first puzzle, which requires hitting a switch before entering the next room. This is transparent and easily understandable. The Palace of Darkness, on the other hand, has a dead set order of tasks for the player to complete while still having a non-linear design. This, in effect, punishes players who explore or scout ahead into rooms that they aren't expected to go into yet, which only serves to make the dungeon feel frustrating rather than challenging. If the devs had just arranged the dungeon's rooms to be linear in order to match the design of the tasks within it, or had they redesigned the tasks themselves to be conducive to the branching nature of the dungeon, then this palace could have been just fine. Instead, it's extremely frustrating, since there is no way for any first-time player to figure out what the right way forward is except through tons of trial and error, or just plain dumb luck. The boss for this dungeon is the Helmasaur King, and unlike the Palace of Darkness itself, he's a well-designed and challenging task for the player to overcome. He can't be damaged until the player manages to destroy his exoskeleton. The hammer is the most obvious option in this regard for many Zelda players, since it's the item that you get in the dungeon you fight him in. A more experimental player will find that bombs do the trick even better. But no matter which you choose, killing him is still a rough ordeal, due to the scattershots of fire he'll spew from his mouth, and his surprisingly high mobility despite being such a large enemy. Killing him nets a heart, and Link! Oh, god damn it, I already complained about you. Get out of here, plot! So yeah, you beat him and get booted out of the dungeon. It's at this point that the game updates the player's map to show all 7 dungeons, which would imply that you're now allowed to go do any of them, right? Well, slow down there, champ, because the hammer only gets you to Dungeon 2. As I mentioned earlier, the Dark World is segmented into several sections that are walled off by a few key dungeon items. To do Dungeon 2, you need to do Dungeon 1, and to do 3 or 4, you need to get the item in Dungeon 2. So it's off to the Swamp Palace we go. I'll preface my many upcoming criticisms of this dungeon by saying that aesthetically, it's one of my favorite dungeons in the whole game. One of my biggest complaints with the dungeon design in A Link to the Past is in just how forgettable the majority of these locations are. The Swamp Palace does such a wonderful job in combating this by picking a theme and rolling with it throughout its entire runtime, that being of an ancient set of sewers with water levels that the player must manipulate in order to proceed. There is something interesting on that note that only this dungeon does. In order to unflood the dungeon and actually enter its lower levels, you have to go to the light world and drain the parallel sewers in Hyrule, thus affecting those of the dungeon. This is such a cool idea, and it really should have been the first of many interactions just like this, but it's the only one of its kind throughout the entire game. I don't know why the devs would tease such a cool interaction between overworlds without capitalizing on it, but that's kind of a good summation for A Link to the Past as a whole. Something exciting that gets more disappointing the further you look into it. Speaking of which, the actual content of this dungeon is probably one of the simplest and most boring sets of rooms that this entire game has to offer. The design of the dungeon is entirely linear, with only one optional room that carries the compass. Other than that, the player's task is to make it past several quick enemies like water tektites and medusas, as well as the slow-moving electric baris, neither of which are particularly challenging to deal with. The main puzzle that this dungeon features is the use of levers to flood certain parts of the dungeon, thus giving access to new rooms for the player to explore. I actually hesitate to call this a puzzle. All the player has to do is follow the straight path the dungeon sets him on to its natural end, then push the obvious looking lever to proceed. Again, for as aesthetically pleasing as that is, its simplicity and lack of any further evolution of the concept past its initial appearance makes it by far one of the weakest dungeon gimmicks in this whole game. The most I can say for the Swamp Palace beyond its atmosphere is that it's short, which is not a compliment that any Zelda dungeon should be striving for. The dungeon item here is the hookshot, which is the greatest goddamn item that has ever graced a Zelda game, and I hate Breath of the Wild for not featuring it. Put the hookshot in every damn game in the series, Miyamoto. I'll buy every copy. The hookshot allows the player to hook onto skulls, treasure chests, and wooden posts. This dungeon does a good job of teaching the player what to do with it in the room that you get it, but doesn't actually use it for any puzzle solving, unfortunately. Luckily, the boss fight with Argus does make good use of it. You have to manage spacing while also using the hookshot to pull in each of his little eyes, then whack it to death with your sword. Once the player survives that, he'll charge you in the water like some of the enemies from the earlier parts of the dungeon, which has to be the smartest design choice in the entirety of the Swamp Palace. Like I said earlier, for all this game's faults, it has the most mechanically satisfying boss fights in the entire Zelda series. Even crap dungeons like the Swamp Palace usually end with great fights like this, which is why I think fans of this title often have fond memories of the dungeons despite their overall poor quality. Once you finish the Swamp Palace, the hookshot can be used to cross Hyrule's main river and make your way to either Dungeon 3 or 4. Starting in chronological order, Dungeon 3, the Skull Dungeon, is by far the most unique one in the entire game. Its design is entirely non-linear at first, with the main gimmick being that the dungeon has several entrances. Only some of these will take the player to where he needs to go, so it's going to take a lot of trial and error before finding the big key and receiving the fire rod, which is a necessary item to acquire in order to proceed further into the dungeon. The main new foe you'll be fighting is the Gibdo, which is tough as all hell to kill with just the Master Sword. Once you acquire the fire rod from deeper in the dungeon though, you'll find that it can one-shot them from a distance, a nice demonstration of your new tool's power. If all that wasn't challenging enough, Dungeon Masters, returning from Zelda 1, will chase down the player and try to force him back to the start. These things recur throughout the entire Zelda series, with varying degrees of fucks and shits being said in response to being grabbed by one. They're rather inoffensive in this dungeon's case though, due to the aforementioned multiple entry points, which limits just how much progress you can possibly lose by being grabbed by one. Thus, they serve as fair roadblocks as opposed to rage-inducing pieces of shit. Once the player acquires the fire rod, he can make his way to the second half of the level layout, which turns into a set of linear challenge rooms. The roadblocks here are quite varied, yet build off of each other quite well. The first room is sort of like a blind maze, having the player navigate through hallways he can't see due to the tiered perspective, in order to find a key that will allow him to proceed forward. The next challenge room adds puzzle solving to the formula. You'll have to plan your way forward just like in the last room, but this time you'll also have to press the right floor switches in order to make it to the end of the room without dying, which is something you can figure out by proper planning and experimentation with said switches. Finally, the third room combines both of these skills with the timed challenge of activating a set of torch sconces to open a door before any one flame goes out, a puzzle that the newly acquired flame rod can assist with. Through all of these challenges, a dungeon master will be stalking you, and getting caught by it during any one of these rooms is a much more devastating prospect than in the earlier half of the dungeon. Thus, Dungeon 3 does something that neither Dungeons 1 or 2 have managed to do so far. It introduces challenges challenges, then slowly cranks up the difficulty while combining elements from several other challenges, all to culminate in a final stretch that tests everything the player has learned up until that point, making the Skull Dungeon a well-designed and memorable level in what has otherwise been a disappointing stretch of main dungeon content. The boss here is Mothula. Mothula will fly erratically across the entire room, and it's up to the player to kill it while also avoiding a spiky death at the end of each conveyor belt. The newly acquired Fire Rod can help a lot here, and assuming you have a magic potion or two, you can end the fight with it alone. But for anyone else, this fight will require a lot of mechanical skill and plenty of restarts. Mothula's death will reward the player with another lesson on Hyrule's long history, and then it's off to Dungeon 4 we go.
Viewers, lovelies, as we call them, as you call yourselves. What do you think? The first time you played this, was it fun? And then the second time were you like, oh man, this level?
Every time, Aaron. Blind's Hideout is the worst dungeon in this game, by far. It starts out with 4 large, identical-looking rooms that hold the compass, map, and big key, which are so easy to obtain that it feels like there's no real point to these rooms. There isn't a single puzzle in any of them, which leads me to believe that they were meant to be combat challenges, considering the abundance of newly introduced Zazaks that make their appearance here. Unfortunately, they provide no challenge to the player whatsoever. Their HP is low, their attacks don't do much damage, and worse than that, they don't even pursue the player in any noticeable way. They simply walk around as if you aren't even there, maybe shooting off a magic attack or two if they feel like it. I'm not sure if their AI is simply broken or if this is how they're intended to function, but regardless, them being the sole challenge in this dungeon makes it entirely yawn-inducing compared to the previous ones. Once you find the big key, you can use it to move on to the next section, at which point you're already halfway done with the entire dungeon, despite the lack of any real combat challenges or even a single puzzle. The next half of the dungeon uses conveyor belts and a mix of Zazaks, Medusas, and Gibbos? Yeah, these things, in order to present some new combat challenges to the player. This is a welcome change from the empty first half, but considering that the last dungeon ended with this, these challenge rooms feel like a step down compared to the last dungeons. And besides, they're over before you even know it, since there are only a total of 4 rooms utilizing these belts. Once you get past the first 2 rooms, you'll have to take a detour and head up some stairs in order to bomb one of the floors for the boss fight. Now, you might be asking at this point, Octo, how the hell would I have known to do that if you hadn't just told me? Well, dear viewer, that's the thing. You wouldn't have. The steps required for triggering the boss fight in this dungeon are so odd and are completely untelegraphed to the player. You see, at the end of the dungeon, you'll find the dungeon item, the Titan's Mitt, and one of the 7 history bitches waiting for you to save her. Turns out, this is the dungeon boss, Blind the Thief, in disguise, and he'll ask the player to take him to safety outside the dungeon. What you're supposed to do instead is bring him into this empty room after having bombed the floor above it, drag him into the light, and then the fight begins. Again, this is not telegraphed to the player at all. I think I just happened to figure it out the first time I played the game, so in other words, I got lucky. But for the sake of experimentation, I decided to do as he asked in one of my latest playthroughs, in order to see how the devs would respond to a player simply doing as they're told. I was pretty curious to see what would happen here. I mean, what would he do if I were unaware of his trick and did as he asked? Would he kill me in some cutscene as punishment for my failure to see through his disguise? Would the fight be moved out to the surrounding town instead? There are so many things that could happen in that scenario, and oh, he just tells you that he doesn't want to go outside. What the fuck? Bitch, you asked me to take you outside. What was his plan here? Ahaha! You have fallen for my trap. Now I shall waste your time by going back to my cell at the end of this shitty dungeon. Good fucking luck getting me back out! Why even tell the player to save him if you're not going to do anything interesting with that concept? Why not just have a normal boss fight waiting at the end of this dungeon? This is so fucking stupid from both a writing and gameplay standpoint. Who the hell came up with it? It not only makes no narrative sense, but it also wastes the player's time with no payoff to speak of. Well, the boss fight is okay at least. You just whack his head with your sword until he dies, but he gains minions as the fight goes on, so there is at least some incremental challenge to it all. Regardless, Blind's hideout is easily the poorest designed dungeon in this entire game, even when compared to the first two, with almost no redeeming qualities in it whatsoever. The Titan's Myth that was acquired earlier in Blind's hideout also serves as the key to opening several more portals to the Dark World hidden in a couple of locations out in the Overworld, thus allowing players access to the last 3 dungeons of the game. Asterix. I am happy to say that the first of these final 3 dungeons, the Ice Palace, is not only a major step up from the terrible level design of Dungeon 4, but is also a brilliantly designed level in its own right. I would even go so far as to say that it is clearly the most well-designed dungeon in the entire game, featuring unique puzzles, well-designed combat challenges, and a well-thought-out layout that complements them all to a T. It is also my personal favorite, in no small part due to its wonderful atmosphere and theme. Just like the Swamp Palace, the Ice Palace is one of the only memorable locations in the whole game, due to it having a solid environmental theme that is actually distinct from other dungeons in the game, most of which can be grouped together in the dark, concrete, vaguely underground category of dungeon architecture. Though, unlike the Swamp Palace, the Ice Palace is memorable not just for its atmosphere, but also for being a well-designed dungeon from a gameplay standpoint, with a lot of smart and deliberate choices having been made in its craft. So let's go through this dungeon step by step and see what it does better than the previous ones. Once you enter the dungeon, it will be made immediately clear to the player that he'll need to use the Fire Rod from Dungeon 3 in order to proceed. While the obvious ice theme is a dead giveaway, the actual softlock on the dungeon comes from the Freezor, a new type of enemy that can only be killed with the Fire Rod. This is an important requirement to telegraph to the player immediately, since the dungeon is filled with these enemies, and because the dungeon boss will require the Fire Rod in order to kill. If you remember Palace 4 from the Zelda 2 review, then you'll know why this is such an important element to creating good dungeon design, and why I appreciate that the level designer actually put something at the beginning of the dungeon that informs the player of what he'll need to acquire before facing off against foes that he can't even kill. The very next room will introduce the main dungeon gimmick behind the Ice Palace, icy floor tiles that will change Link's traction and make him harder to control. The 3 Abaris you'll face here aren't too tough, which is important when introducing this mechanic, since the next room and beyond will up the challenge with Pangators, foes who will take advantage of the ice and use it to slide towards the player at high speeds. This first room is big and open, thus allowing the player to acclimate to the challenge. Consequently, the very next room gives less space to maneuver in, and adds a Medusa to shake things up a bit. The room after this presents a switch puzzle to the player, which requires a few bombs to solve. Brilliantly, this bomb puzzle takes place right before the player fights the newly introduced Stalfos Knights, who can only be killed with bombs. All in the span of a single floor, the developers have managed to introduce a new, game-changing mechanic that alters Link's very physics, and present a puzzle that naturally flows into the very next room by necessitating the use of that next room's required equipment. This kind of intricate, deliberate design is what I'm looking for when determining how well made these dungeons are, and the Ice Palace has it in spades going forward. After heading through a conveyor belt challenge room, the player will be introduced to a room with a brand new type of trap, the Guru Bar. Again, who the fuck comes up with these names? The tight walkway and the long reach of the bar itself makes getting hit almost inevitable for brand new players, which is important to teach, since the Guru Bar will make an appearance in every dungeon going forward. Heading down to the next floor, holy crap! Did this game just throw a firing line of penguins at me? Yeah, so another thing that's great about this dungeon, design-wise, is the smart enemy placement. The last dungeon, and several before it, just plopped the foes in. And sure, each enemy in the game is varied and interesting enough for that to work in some cases. But the Ice Palace actually takes the time to deliberately arrange the enemies in such a way that they pose a greater threat, like, say, all charging Link at at once. Point being, the enemy placement feels deliberate and planned in this room, as well as the dungeon as a whole, and I really appreciate that level of care being put into the dungeon design after the many lackluster examples we've seen so far. Once we enter the next room, whoa! Okay, that's a very memorable experience. Just walking into a room, then suddenly being assaulted by a large yellow trap. We'll get back to this in a moment, but yes, this is a deliberate design choice. Besides that, another important design choice is made at this junction. The dungeon, up until this point, has been linear. Each room I have thus far described has been in order, and each player will thus far have had the same experience. That all changes at this hallway. The player is now allowed free reign to explore the rest of the dungeon free of any guided path. This is a bold design choice, but one that works well for a few reasons. One, the game has already introduced several linear and non-linear dungeons, starting from those very first two introductory dungeons at the beginning of the game, and has upped the challenge for each of them since then, to varying degrees of success. Combining both types into one dungeon that starts out linear but then branches out is therefore a natural synthesis of the two concepts, thus giving it some precedence in the game's design thus far. Secondly, the many tasks still yet to be completed are mostly optional, barring acquiring the big key. The player does not need to acquire the compass, map, or even the dungeon item in order to complete the Ice Palace, or proceed through the rest of the game. That fact, therefore, leaves the player with the choice of how much more of the dungeon they want to do. Will they find the key, kill the boss, and bounce? Or will they explore the dungeon for all it has to give, even at the risk of death? It mostly depends on the kind of player you are, but the fact that the option exists is a major positive for a game like Zelda, which prioritizes the player's own sense of curiosity and initiative more than anything else. The two choices you'll have here are to either go north or west, and while both will lead you to several dungeon treasures, no one will lead you to all of them. Should you choose to go through the north hallway, you'll be dropped into a large room filled with ice tiles, guru bars, and pangators all trying to kill you as Link slides around on the ice frantically. You can explore around this room to your heart's content, or just head into the door on your right to escape. This will lead to a hookshot room filled with red barries, then a trap room, then another hookshot room with a small key, which can then lead you back to the starting room by going west, or to the big key by going up a floor, which also connects back to the very beginning of the dungeon, in case you need to go back upstairs for anything you might have missed. Jesus Christ, does this dungeon intertwine in intelligent ways. I think it's important in such a large and sprawling dungeon to have certain landmarks serve as waypoints, so as to not let the player lose his way. For as much as I love Zelda 1, many of those rooms in each dungeon look exactly the same, with very little but enemy placement and random blocks serving as the differentiating markers. The Ice Palace instead makes every room have a different layout, or give it a memorable marker in order to combat this. And that's where we come back around to talk about the large trap in the middle of this hallway. It is such a memorable experience to be suddenly walking into this room, then being assaulted by a big yellow trap you've never seen before, that every player will remember this as the starting room to the non-linear half of the dungeon, no matter how good or bad their memory is. This is an intelligent and deliberate design choice on the part of the developers, in order to reduce the possibility of players completely losing their way, which would likely just be frustrating rather than fun. Whether the player decided to go north first or not, the only other path is to go west. This will eventually lead to a room with nothing but a pitfall, so I guess we'll just— whoa! Okay, so now a couple freezers will stop the player in his tracks, and killing them nets a chest with bombs. And there are some cracked floors behind the stairs, just like the one from earlier in the dungeon. This is the developer's way of telling the player to stop and think about the room a little, or else they'll regret it. So let's follow the developer's invisible hands for a moment and see where this goes. Bombing the floor, we head down and— it's the dungeon item, how neat! The item for this dungeon is the blue mail, which halves incoming damage, thank God, because the enemies in this dungeon and beyond, if you hadn't noticed, are hitting Link for anywhere between 2 and 6 hearts of health. Regardless of that difficulty spike, this is still only an optional item. The player is free to search for it and obtain the mail's protection, or simply complete the dungeon. Better yet, some players actually choose to skip the mail and sword upgrades in order to purposefully give themselves a harder challenge. Regardless Regardless, it's up to you, the player, to find the key, then find the chest if you really want that sweet, sweet blue mail. But the devs are at least trying to guide the player to it via their offhand game design, which is great for both first-time players and veterans to the game. No matter what paths you took to solve the final half of the dungeon, all will circle back around to the boss room door, which will lead to the fight with Cold Stare. Cold Stare kind of just sits there while hurling giant ice balls at you, with splash damage being dealt in alternating cross and X patterns. The key to this fight is to use the Fire Rod, which was alluded to at the very beginning of the dungeon. And once you thaw him, he will split into 3 separate bodies and begin to slide around the room like a hockey puck. This is somewhat like the fight with Argus, but the 3 different targets makes it a fair evolution on the previous concept. And with that, the Ice Palace is done. I know this section was long, but I think it's important to highlight all of this dungeon's design aspects due to my claims of its superiority over the design of the other main dungeons in this game. I don't want to say something like that without backing it up with examples and facts, and I think with that, I've managed to highlight how intelligently planned and well executed the design of this dungeon is, especially when compared to the generally haphazard design choices made in the previous dungeons. Before we talk about the next dungeon's content, I think it's important to elaborate on what the asterisk I mentioned earlier in the video was when talking about being able to do any of these last 3 dungeons, Misery Mire included. You see, as I mentioned earlier, the world of Hyrule is rich with content, and very well designed in how it continues to provide the player with incentives to explore the overworld. That being said, there are, for some unholy reason, 2 non-telegraphed progression gates in the overworld that are required to beat this game, both of which are magic spells. Let me explain what I mean when I say non-telegraphed, by first giving you an example of what a telegraphed progression gate looks like. In order to get into the second introductory dungeon, the Desert Palace, you need to find the Book of Mudora. This is told to the player by a throwaway character hiding out in the desert where the dungeon is located. Thus, it is a telegraphed task, one that is being laid bare for the player so that no frustration comes to him when he realizes what he has to do in order to advance through the game. The Ether spell, on the other hand, is never mentioned at all by a single character or block of text in this entire game. And what's more, it's so out of the way that I can completely understand anyone who needs to pull out a guide at this point of the game. You have to acquire the Ether spell to enter this dungeon. There just is no other way, and it's completely untelegraphed to the player where they need to go or what they need to do in order to open the dungeon, unless they already found the spell while exploring on their own, like I did. Regardless of that mess, Misery Mire now awaits, and while, Lord knows, it has its future problems, the dungeon at least starts out rather strong, with a consistent design philosophy that is executed rather competently. Right off the bat, the dungeon will introduce a deadly combination of foes, the Beamos we've seen before, and the returning Wizrobes from Zelda 1. They aren't quite as varied or interesting in this title as they were in the first game, but the Wizrobes still manage to ambush the player with their teleporting antics and work well when paired with other foes, like in this room. Once the player pushes past them, he will be plopped into the central room of the dungeon and be left to figure things out from here on his own, since this dungeon is almost entirely non-linear from this point forward, and in the best way. Every time I play this game, I remember and forget different parts of the dungeon, thus making my path through it differ on every playthrough. What enables that kind of flexibility and replayability is the intelligent design of the non-linear paths themselves. The main gimmick of Dungeon 6 is the collection of keys, of which there are 6, yet only 4 of them, I have found when looking at the dungeon's design, are absolutely necessary to complete it. What's smart about these keys is their placement, and in the placement of the doors themselves. Try as I might, I found no gap in the design, and no matter how many keys I wasted, the dungeon was always possible to complete. What's more, you're allowed to complete the many locked sections of the dungeons in any order you want. Sure, you can head through the rooms to the northeast, circle around to the west, then collect the key in this room full of spikes and turrets, or you could use the very first key you find to approach it from the south, then circle around the opposite direction. Or better yet, you can entirely skip over this part of the dungeon because it only eats up the key you gain anyway, making it entirely useless. I never even realized that until looking at the map of Misery Mire while writing this script, which says something really positive about this dungeon. The rooms are so well designed and packed full of challenges that even the ones designed to eat up keys always felt like necessary parts of the dungeon to me after 3 separate playthroughs. For all the different paths one can explore, there is still the task of obtaining the big key to tackle, and it's here where we see the dungeon's first slip up. There's a set of stairs that takes the player to a couple rooms with some torch sconces in them, but no door for them to open. So going into the next room, which is also a dead end, we'll be greeted by Sahasrara, who will give the player the answer to the puzzle. I'm not even kidding, he just tells you to light the torches to open the way forward. Like, not that I couldn't have gotten it without him, but for any aspiring game developers watching this video, and you really need to hear this, if you're designing a game based on dungeons filled with puzzles to solve, don't ever give the player the answer, and especially don't do so in the very same fucking room where the puzzle is. It makes your game feel like it was made for 4-year-olds, and even they would probably roll their eyes at being so easily provided the answer. Once the game solves that puzzle for the player, he'll be rewarded with the dungeon key, allowing him to now delve further into the dungeon. But if he does exactly that, he'll be promptly bonked on the head and told to go fuck himself by the dungeon's poor design. Because despite this being easily the most non-linear dungeon, with by far the most optional and or useless rooms for the player to explore, this is also a dungeon where the player has to get the dungeon item in order to finish it, which he'll promptly realize once he can't advance any further through the future sections of the dungeon. That, or he'll spend half an hour messing around with this puzzle, wondering what the hell he's missing here. Turns out, it's the Cane of Samaria, found near the very beginning of the dungeon, only after you acquire the big key. And it is, just the worst fucking item in Zelda history. It, get this, makes blocks. That's it. It makes blocks. And for some reason, it also makes floating platforms in the next dungeon only? I don't get the logic behind this item, but even disregarding logic, the Cane of Samaria is a terribly implemented item with only one odd function to fulfill in the dungeon in which it is introduced in, opening this door. It does not get used in the overworld, nor are there any interesting level designs or puzzles created to accommodate it. It simply exists to block off future progress. Anyway, the rest of the dungeon, which again does not utilize this new item at all, is very straightforward. There is a short switch puzzle that is exacerbated by the darkness of these rooms. You have to find a bombable wall that can lead to a second switch in order to get past a set of 2 fences. Then the dungeon is pretty much finished from there. So, up until this point, we've had a dungeon with a wonderfully non-linear beginning, which is then unfortunately tainted by a terrible final puzzle, a horribly designed dungeon item, and a useless progression gate that necessitates that dungeon item without further developing it. Okay, so not the best dungeon, but the dungeon boss is still waiting at the end, so let's see how that is. Oh, that's right. Misery Mire is also home to the most miserably designed dungeon boss in A Link to the Past. Yes, Vitreous, a literal blob of a boss, simply spews his eyeballs at the player without any shakeup. You know, beyond the pathetic bit of lightning that won't even hit you if you move slightly to the left or right. And remember how the boss in the Swamp Palace started charging you after defeating his minions, and the one in the last dungeon did the very same thing, but there were 3 of him? Well, Vitreous is back at it again, except that he de-escalates the challenge by slowly bouncing towards the player rather than charging him. All in all, Vitreous is definitely the worst designed boss fight in A Link to the Past. Yes, even more so than Aghanim. So I suppose all of those negatives, despite the dungeon's promising design at the beginning, managed to bog down the dungeon's quality quite a bit, to the point where I wouldn't feel comfortable rating it as anything beyond kind of okay, as far as dungeon design goes. Luckily, the next dungeon, Turtle Rock, is a huge step up from Misery Mire, even housing my favorite boss fight in the entire game. This dungeon has more than just a killer ending though. The whole damn thing is such a well-executed blend of linear and maze-like dungeon design, punctuated with well-made incremental challenges, making Turtle Rock one of the best levels in the entire game. The dungeon begins by introducing its new central mechanic through a clever controlled environment, by first providing the player with a full magic meter, then by presenting him with a mysterious railway. This is where the player must use the Cane of Samaria from the last dungeon, and while its usage in this dungeon does not justify its otherwise terrible existence, the platform and railway combinations it is involved in are at least used in some pretty fantastic puzzle-solving scenarios, as we'll soon see going forward. Upon entering the very next room, the same railway we just used is once again presented to the player, but this time with branching paths that can be manually navigated past. The railway itself is shaped like a square, allowing the player to navigate to the several rooms that branch off from this central one in any order that they want to. The door to the player's immediate right is the path that holds the necessary key and dungeon map used to progress forward, but also presents a puzzle to the player that utilizes the new railway system. Along this railway's path, there are 4 torch sconces that, when lit, allow the player to progress forward and collect his prizes, but the rails present a unique problem. Since they run at a relatively slow speed in a predetermined path, the player will have to light the torches in such a way that they all stay lit until the platform makes it back to the start, allowing the player to move into the next room before the door closes. This is a wonderful evolution of the torch puzzles we've seen in past dungeons, since it now adds a whole new mechanical challenge to this previously established puzzle archetype. Once the player overcomes that challenge room and receives his prize, he can return to the previous central room and either continue forward through the locked door or explore the 2 optional rooms housed on this first floor. The first one is a simple trap room that rewards the player with a full magic elixir. The other optional room houses a single treasure chest with the compass, but after claiming it, the player will be greeted by this dungeon's all-new trap, the Laser Eye. That is actually what it says on this piece of paper. Fucking hell, guys, can you at least try to come up with an actual name rather than just stating what it is? Thanks. Because of the design of this room, wherein the eye is blocking the only path out, the player will be forced to learn how to overcome this trap before heading any further into the dungeon, which is great level design, considering just how prevalent and deadly these things are in the future sections of the dungeon. Turns out it only fires when making eye contact with Link, so the trick to dealing with the laser eye is to simply back up towards it. Once the player has explored this room to his heart's content, he will need to head through the locked door, where he will meet a brand new type of enemy, the Hoku Boku? Really, guys? I know I just said to give it an actual name, but that just sounds like nonsense. Yes, I know it's Japanese, but okay, well, at least you tried this time. A for effort. This single combat room acts as a wonderful introduction to the Hoku Bokus and their unique mechanics as Zelda enemies. When attacking a Hoku Boku, which appears as a set of stacked round objects, each part of its body shall be flung across the room and bounce off the walls, potentially hitting the player. This adds depth to the combat encounters with these foes. Since players now need to manage their spacing, both in the sense that they must keep away from the Hoku Boku as it bounces around the room, and must be careful not to be hit by its body parts as the fight goes on, thus making the fight feel more like a mini-boss encounter rather than just another weak photo whack. The next couple of rooms introduce a system of pipes used to transport the player without his knowledge as to where exactly he'll end up. Along the way, the player will pick up the dungeon key and then be plopped into another set of rooms. While you can technically just head deeper into the dungeon at this point, the next set of optional rooms will reward the player with 2 prizes, a heart piece and the optional dungeon item. Obtaining the piece of heart will require some out-of-the-box thinking, because it's technically found outside of the dungeon, but in a part of the overworld that is only accessible via Turtle Rock. There is a balcony that leads outside the dungeon, which, when switching to the light world, will reward the player with a cave that houses this game's final piece of heart. I'm not sure whether to count this as a positive towards this game's already impressive overworld design, or as a plus for the design of Turtle Rock itself as a dungeon, so I'll just mention it here by saying that it's a really neat way to utilize the magic mirror mechanic, and reward players who use it even up until the very end of the game. The final room on this detour rewards the player with the dungeon item, the Mirror Shield, which can block the beams of those pesky laser eyes, as well as stronger magic attacks from Lynels and other such tough enemies. Regardless of whether or not the player took this route, it will reconverge with the linear path forward, which shoves the player through another pipe and presents another room with a Hokuboku to kill. Bombing the wall here will open the way forward, and eventually lead the player to the dungeon's second basement. It is here where the dungeon takes the railways that were introduced from the beginning to their logical extreme. This game doesn't do it often, but this one dungeon mechanic is such a wonderful example of incremental difficulty done right. The railways, which start out simple, have now tangled into a large mess of tracks with junctions sprinkled throughout that grant the player only some level of control as to where he is going. The key here is to not only find the correct path to reach the exit, but also find the button that actually opens the door. These challenges are then compounded by the many guru bars that whittle away at the player's health the longer it takes him to figure it all out, thus making this room pretty damn hard to navigate through unscathed. But it is that difficulty, which has been built upon little by little with each previous room involving these railways, that makes the puzzle so damn great. Whereas many other dungeons in A Link to the Past see fit to stop using their main gimmick before it reaches its logical extreme, or fail to even build upon a single central challenge in the first place, Turtle Rock manages to build upon its puzzles until they reach their absolute peak challenge, while also introducing them at such a pace that the player is not made to feel lost or confused by each new puzzle's difficulty spike. When descending into Turtle Rock's final basement, the player is given one last magic elixir and a tense railway ride before heading into the boss room, where they will have to face off against this game's biggest threat yet. The Trinix, as the name somewhat implies, is a three-headed foe with a special gimmick to it. Its two subheads are elementally charged, with one spewing ice and the other shooting fire. The answer to this deadly quandary is to respond in turn with the opposite element via the fire and ice stabs. The player can then either risk a head-first assault with the sword if they want to conserve magic, or just kill the heads with nothing but magic, which requires a few potions and some good accuracy, but will ensure the player's safety from a distance. The heads themselves will either deal heavy fire damage or even freeze the floor itself if the player doesn't kill the second head fast enough, thus changing the very environment that the fight takes place in the longer that it goes on. Should the player survive that phase, the Trinix will then break out of its shell and take the form of a large stone snake. Whereas previous bosses who utilized a similar second phase mostly just charged at the player or bounced around the room, the Trinix will follow the player's every move, while also boasting invulnerability to his every attack. His weak spot is his midsection, which can be difficult to get at due to its tenacity in chasing Link, but should the player prove mechanically gifted enough, the Trinix will be slain, and Princess Zelda, finally, is saved. Once the player has completed all 7 main dungeons and saved the 7 magical girls, Zelda will inform the player that the time has come to finally defeat Ganon and stop his evil plan to invade Hyrule, because for some reason the all-powerful wish-granting Triforce can't seem to just do that for him. So the player will head off to the Dark World equivalent of the Tower of Hera, where the 7 maidens will finally make themselves useful and tear down Ganon's magical barrier. From here, the player can enter the very final dungeon that the game has to offer, Ganon's Tower. For those of you who saw the Zelda 1 review, you might have some hint as to how I feel about this dungeon's design. But just so I make this clear right off the bat, A Link to the Past's final dungeon serves as a wonderful medley of all the skills that the player has learned up until this point in the game, and is glued together with such a wonderful set of puzzles, combat challenges, and both linear and non-linear room design that it ends up as one of the greatest end dungeons to ever grace a Zelda game to this day. While the game as a whole may be host to an inconsistent set of dungeons quality-wise, the final dungeon and boss fight leaves this game on such a wonderful high note that I am absolutely sure that it plays a large part in this game's resoundingly positive legacy, even in spite of its many hiccups. As mentioned earlier, Ganon's Tower is host to a mix of linear and non-linear dungeon design, starting off non-linear by presenting the player with 3 separate pathways to investigate. The middle door leads upstairs, and while the player is allowed to solve the puzzles and traps set for him on that floor, he will be unable to proceed any further without first acquiring the big key, thus pushing him to take one of the other paths. Both of these doors lead downstairs, and both end with the big key, thus only necessitating that the player explores one of them. Of course, he'll then miss out on any optional goodies that may be hidden along the way, but that's his choice to make, and at this point in the game, that isn't necessarily an unwise one anymore. The path to the right leads to a more puzzle-oriented set of challenges, starting off with a closed door that necessitates finding the right pressure plate, and using the Cane of Samaria to keep it open. The next room is host to a fantastically designed mechanical challenge that utilizes the flying tiles, several turrets, and a dungeon master in order to keep the player running frantically around the room, dodging their every attack. The room after this presents the game's final torch puzzle of its kind, and this time, the player must not only scout out ahead in order to find an optimal path to light the torches in, but must also create that optimal path by clearing enemies and obstacles that would otherwise slow him down. The result is a puzzle that feels like it truly caps off the experience that the player has gained over the course of the entire game, providing the player with a sense of accomplishment and finality before the final moments of the game. The next room contains a bomb and switch puzzle, and the room after that houses the dungeon's compass, the unique reward that awaits players who took this route over the other one. The player is then teleported to the final section of the dungeon's basement, surrounded by endless pits and a torch sconce. Lighting it will reveal the way forward, using these newly introduced invisible pathways, which will be featured in the very next room as well. Though the player can charge right ahead and rely on trial and error in order to make it through here, there is in fact a hidden torch sconce that the player can activate with the fire rod, which will show the player the way just like in the previous room. From here, you'll be dropped into a mini-boss room with the previously fought Armos Knight. Though he hasn't been buffed at all, and thus will be easier to kill using the player's upgraded sword, the ice tiles that litter the boss room floor will make it harder for the player to attack at close range, thus forcing him to rely on the bow, or risk a close encounter in order to deal extra damage. Once the player overcomes that challenge, he will be rewarded with the big key, allowing access to the upper floors of the dungeon, and the red mail, an endgame set of armor that can shield the player for 3/4 of an enemy's damage output. If that sounds overpowered, just wait until we get to the fight with Ganon, and you'll see why that's there. Before moving on with the upper floors of the dungeon, however, let's talk about the alternate route that the player may still yet choose to explore in order to receive the dungeon map, or potentially could have gone through first in order to receive the big key. I mentioned earlier that the path to the right we just explored was more puzzle-based, and while this path to the left is host to a few new puzzles, it's more focused on mechanically driven, traversal challenges instead. The very first room on this path is home to some moles and a block-pushing puzzle, with conveyor belts and a bumper circling around them. The player will have to whack 2 of them in order to make the block pushable, and thus open the door, which will then lead to a hookshot room. The player can then retrieve the map, this path's optional goodie, then solve a different yet equally challenging bomb and switch puzzle from the one presented in the parallel path. Eventually, these rooms will lead to a set of teleporters that serve to create a maze, which will require memorization and intuition on the player's part to overcome. And then finally, this path will reconverge with the one from earlier by leading the player to the very same room that lies before the mini-boss. Only one of these 2 paths are necessary, but completing both will net the player with the compass and map. Both are also host to a set of equally stimulating challenges, be they torch or switch puzzles, hookshot rooms, or teleportation mazes. The options presented by these separate yet converging paths also provide several different experiences for the player depending on their personality type and how they play games. Sure, I usually like exploring the entirety of dungeons and leaving no room unchecked, but some people aren't quite that meticulous and will be more than happy to move on after only taking one path. The options presented here do not come at the expense of the dungeon's quality, and therefore are nothing but beneficial to the overall design of the dungeon. Regardless of how much time the player spends exploring the dungeon's first floor, the big key is all that's needed to continue ascending up the tower, starting with the 4th floor. This floor does something unique when compared to the other dungeons in this game. Here, each successive room builds upon the same base challenges in order to provide an ever-changing yet fluid set of combat rooms for the player to experience. The first one is host to Zazaks, Stalfos, and conveyor belts. The next adds a BMOS turret on top of the Stalfos, and the one after that adds traps, a second BMOS, and a third foe. The next room introduces ice tiles to the equation, while also toughening up the foes, and the final room is completely filled with ice tiles, while still hosting a BMOS, foes, and a newly added turret. I really appreciate how connected these rooms feel thematically, while each providing their own challenges in increments. But it all happens so fast that the fifth room will feel entirely different from the first, despite the clear evolution that one can see when looking at the dungeon map. These challenges all culminate in a final room holding a second mini-boss, which hosts the land molas we fought all the way back in the Desert Palace. A turret is also added in, but other than that, it's the same fight as before. The fifth floor is comparatively unremarkable, but is instead mostly just a host for the pitfall room needed for the final mini-boss fight held on floor 6, a rematch with the Moldorm from the Tower of Hera. Once he's defeated, the way to Aghanim is all but clear, giving way to your final duel with him, which is exactly the same as the first one. Yep, the only difference here is that he spawns 2 copies, which can actually make the fight easier since they also shoot magic blasts that can be directed back at the real Aghanim, thus allowing you to kill him in only 2 or 3 strokes. If this were the final boss fight, it would be pathetically lame. But luckily, the story takes a sadly predictable and inconsequential twist by revealing that Aghanim was only Ganon's alter ego. He flies off into the night, and in a plot hole made famous by Game Grumps, the bird you can only use to fast travel in the light world suddenly appears and helps Link chase after him.
Wait, how's your little bird friend there?
I don't know.
That is a fucking plot hole right
Don't
there.
ask questions. He flew in through the hole again and left in the ceiling.
Thus begins the final boss fight in this game, Link's duel with the Prince of Darkness. The final fight with Ganon, just like the final dungeon, is one of the best end encounters to ever grace a Zelda game. Mechanically speaking, this encounter is the most satisfying and challenging Ganon fight in the entire series. Ganon has 4 phases throughout the fight, with each one raising the stakes dramatically. His first phase involves his trident, which he throws around the room like a boomerang that the player will have to dodge. He will also teleport to different parts of the room after throwing it, thus further manipulating the trajectory of his trident. The sword is the only weapon that can defeat Ganon for the first 3 phases of the fight, and if the player didn't spend any time looking for the sword or mail upgrades, then this is the part of the game where he'll seriously regret it, because Ganon is built like a tank and hits with just as much force. Beyond that, his teleportation makes him agile beyond what one would expect of such a large beast, and as the player shall learn during his second phase, Ganon is also a master wizard with several deadly spells up his sleeve. The second phase begins with one of these spells. Ganon will cast several fireballs that will surround him, which, beyond just serving as a barrier through which he can keep the player's attacks at bay, he will also turn them into bats that will chase the player down and try to predict his trajectory in order to intercept him. If the player manages to deal enough damage to Ganon to stop that onslaught, he will begin his third phase, in which he'll teleport across the room and destroy parts of the floor surrounding him. Just like the Moldorm fight, if the player falls into these newly formed pits, he will have to start the fight all over again. Though this isn't entirely unproductive, since Sahasrahla will provide the answer as to how to kill Ganon to any player who fails in his fight and falls down here. I'm glad this was restrained until after the player fails, as that feels a lot less annoying than if Sahasrahla just told you without your consent. But yes, to kill Ganon during his final phase, the player will need the silver arrows, an item only found while exploring the pyramid outside of where the fight takes place. So at the very least, any player who has neglected to receive them by this point won't don't have to look very far. Ganon's fourth and final phase involves another magical skill of his, this time invisibility, in which Ganon snuffs out the room's torches and disappears, while throwing magical spells at the player from the darkness. The player will then have to relight those sconces without being knocked off the edge, which is made difficult due to the torch's proximity to the edge of the room, and then strike Ganon before the sconces can be snuffed out again. The player must then strike Ganon with a silver arrow, just like in the first game. Do this 4 times, and Ganon shall finally die, and the player will have beaten the game. The Triforce will speak to Link, and tell him that its power is now his to command, and the incredibly happy set of credits, alongside the many obviously revived characters, implies that Link's wish was to bring back all of those who had died during the course of the game's runtime. This set of end credits begins a trend in the Zelda series, in which the imagery and staff roll soundtracks are the most kick-ass of any video game series ever. Seriously, I don't even like this game's ending story-wise, yet I fucking love this set of end credits. It not only does a perfect job of showing off the brand new world that Link has wished for, but also evokes such a wonderful sense of finality with Koji Kondo's legendary soundtrack blaring in the background. I can absolutely understand how the end of this game can make people feel emotional, and even lull them into forgetting all of its flaws. And that's a topic I want to end the video on. Why is it that despite this game's cavalcade of issues, it still is consistently ranked as one of the greatest games of all time, even above some of its successors? First, though, let's set the record straight. Do I like A Link to the Past? The answer is, kind of. I have fun while playing it, most of the time anyway, and that's great. I like fun. Who doesn't like fun? But that's not the question I'm trying to answer with this video, or honestly, any video of mine. If this channel was just about telling you whether or not I liked a video game, then I could make 5-minute reviews with absolutely no substance to them whatsoever. Because the truth is, one man's fun is another man's torture. I like Zelda games. I like their puzzles, their combat, and their music. Ever since I first played Twilight Princess when I was just 8 years old and Skyward Sword when I was 11, I've had a nostalgic connection to these games. Yet, I can still look at them on an objective scale and see the flaws inherent in their game design. Which is why, despite my fond childhood memories of Skyward Sword, I now hate that game. The truth is, for as much fun as can be had with A Link to the Past, it simply pales in comparison to other members of its own series. Out of this game's 11 dungeons, 8 of them are below the average for what I would consider a good dungeon. Some are terrible, like the Palace of Darkness, the Swamp Palace, or Blind's Hideout, but most of them are simply what I would call serviceable. The East Palace and the Desert Palace may serve as wonderful juxtapositions as to what linear and non-linear dungeons look like, but they are still simple and unremarkable when judged on their own merit. Sure, the Tower of Hera introduces true puzzles to the Zelda series, but as a standalone level design, it's just okay. And yeah, the Skull Dungeon has a unique, non-linear path to its solution, but it's over in a flash and only starts to get challenging at the very end, at which point it's all over and you just head on to the next dungeon. Yes, Misery Mire starts out with a truly non-linear, maze-like design, but the puzzles held within that structure are weak and sometimes just plain frustrating. By my count, only 3 dungeons are what I could even remotely rate as good. But that's only 3 out of 11 dungeons. Only another 5 are serviceable, and the final 3 are complete garbage. So you tell me, does that sound like the definitive Zelda experience, as so many critics have labeled this game as being? Besides the dungeons, the game doesn't even rank super high in its other categories either. Yes, the overworld can be wonderful to explore, with secrets cleverly hidden throughout, but the characters inhabiting that world are one-dimensional, the side quests are simple and demand very little effort or thought, and sometimes the player is completely gated off from exploration for seemingly no valid reason, with the Dark World in particular being guilty of this sin during the back half of the game. And the story! Holy shit, that is a fucking mess. The villain, Aghanim, is laughable. He only has 3 lines of dialogue in the entire game, and he turns out to be Ganon anyway, who actually has no motive to speak of. His goal is to conquer the world. Why? What does he actually want? Money? Fame? Love? We don't know. And worse still, there are plot holes galore involving his plan. The Triforce is omniscient and omnipotent. The game says so itself. So why hasn't he won already? The explanation given by the history bitches is that he couldn't find a way out of the Golden Land. But this is ridiculous, because 1, it's as simple as looking into a fucking mirror, and 2, what part of omnipotent do the writers not understand here? An all-powerful wishing device should, theoretically, be able to bust him out of the Dark World with no problem. But worst of all, Ganon already knows how to bust out of the Light World. He's Aghanim in disguise, so that means he can escape whenever he wants to. So why did he lose? And don't tell me it's because the Triforce just couldn't do it. Because 1, omnipotent, and 2, Link clearly makes multiple all-powerful wishes at the end of the game. He returns the Golden Land and its inhabitants to their original shape, brings scores of human beings back from the dead, and returns Hyrule to prosperity. Ganon has already won by the beginning of the game, according to this text crawl. So what the hell is even happening here? How do we even have a game at this point? Why is this plot so stupid? It wouldn't even bother me, except for the fact that the game takes the time to force this story on the player. Every dungeon you beat after the first 3 bombards Link with scores of historical information on the world of Hyrule. This is complete garbage and wastes the player's time, so I can't just ignore it, and neither can anyone else who plays this game. A Link to the Past was the first Zelda game of its kind, and that's why people love it. Being the first in such an illustrious series of games, a bias persists around this title that seems to prevent many people from fairly criticizing it. Yes, the graphics are nostalgic. Yes, the music is wonderful, and yes, the last couple of hours are a blast, and the game ends on such a wonderful high note. But there's another 30 hours of game that I think many people willingly ignore when they talk about this title's quality. Sure, there are some genuine improvements when compared to Zelda 1, but the base gameplay, including the freedom to explore, the consistency of the dungeon design, the quick pace, and the lack of a shitty story, all make Zelda 1 far more timeless than A Link to the Past, and a better fit for anyone who appreciates Zelda games based on their exploration and sense of freedom. For my money, this is the true definitive 2D Zelda title. It encapsulates all of the design aspects that people appreciate about the older games, without any of the extra fat that got piled on by some of the later titles in the series, this game included. But even in the face of several of its successors, it's still a lesser entry in the series to me. I haven't reviewed them yet, but games like Ocarina of Time or Twilight Princess improve upon A Link to the Past's formula in a far better way. Yes, they have less freedom, but their stories are engaging or deep or epic, and the characters are actually lovable and have true character development. They aren't just blank slates used to convey story or tutorial information to the player. And their dungeons are host to some of the greatest level designs in video game history, while also injecting completely unique atmospheres, tones, music tracks, and goals into each and every one of them. Sure, A Link to the Past still outclasses some of its successors. Wind Waker may have more freedom in general to its world design, but it comes at the cost of repeat content or interesting ways to traverse that world. Yes, Skyward Sword has more atmospheric dungeons, but their designs are generally worse than even the poor offerings found in the dungeons of Zelda 3. But those two are, in my opinion, some of the worst games in the series, so that's still not saying much. The truth is, A Link to the Past stands in an odd middle for the Zelda series. It's a good game, but not anything more. Yes, it's historically important, but so is Zelda 1, and that game is still unique and fundamentally great enough for me to recommend it to anyone who can stomach older video games. Instead, Zelda 3's main call to fame is that it was the first to establish the Zelda formula. But sadly, it isn't even close to the best in that regard. As far as 2D Zelda games go, it's not a bad place to start, but beyond that, I really can't say that this game holds much merit. If you love Zelda games, or like top-down 2D adventure games, you'll definitely like this one. Go ahead. But for anyone who is just a casual fan of the 3D games, or God forbid, you generally don't like Zelda games in the first place, then this isn't the game for you. I give The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past a 7 out of 10. Like I said, it's a fun game, and sometimes it's even a good game. The Overworld, while not perfect, is still quite standout and is my favorite aspect of this title. And the combat is fundamentally well designed enough for it to tie the whole experience together, in particular considering just how wonderful the boss fights in this game are. But it isn't the timeless classic so many people think it is. Its dungeon design has been outdone by nearly every Zelda game that has come after it, and its story is so poorly written, and told through one of the most horrendous examples of exposition that I have ever seen in a video game. All of these factors result in an experience that is sure to charm many, but likely won't stick in your head without a heavy dose of nostalgia to go along with it. So that's A Link to the Past. I hope I didn't piss off too many of you with that Debbie Downer of a conclusion. I know this game has a lot of fans, and I'm sure they don't like me saying bad things about it. But the wonderful thing about my channel is that it's still relatively small, so I can and will respond to any comments you'll leave me. So go ahead, tell me why you disagree with the video, if you do, and I'll be happy to debate the different aspects of the game. I try to cover everything about a video game in my analyses, but maybe there's something you didn't see mentioned that you want to bring up. So please, feel free to respond to the video however you wish. Anyway, thank you one and all so much for watching. This was my longest video yet by far, and I'm so glad to finally get it done. Stay tuned for a channel update in the next couple of days. I have a few announcements to make at that time, but regardless, thank you once again for watching my videos, and have yourself a very nice day.